cattle, oxen, cows, sheep, swine, goats, horses, asses, elephants, curelums, and cumems. We know the Jaredites brought animals, right? So then we have to look and say, well, what of these were available for them to bring? It looks like all of them, except for curelum and cumem, or things that they brought from the old world. That's kind of what the text indicates. Um, so they brought flocks and herds and other beast animals. And then the vessel was compared by Ether to Noah's Ark in a way. It was tied into like Noah's Ark. So there's almost kind of this concept that they were kind of again, a biblical typology going on here of putting two animals in or something like this.
Mormonism
And
with the Murph, where Larry Singh explores church history and the church's truth claims. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to my channel, Mormonism with the Murph, where Larry Singh explores the church's history and the church's truth claims. And I have back joining me again today, geologist and researcher and engineer, Jerry Gruber. Jerry, thank you for joining me today.
yeah, it's good to be here.
Yeah, thanks for sacrificing your Saturday morning and waking up early for this. We've done multiple episodes before. We've done episodes on geology, looking at some of the convergences in Mesoamerica with geology and volcanic eruptions and earthquakes happening in that century in Mesoamerica. We've done videos on the character documents, and we've also done recently a couple episodes on the gold plates as well. And Jerry has done a lot of research into Mesoamerica. And I wanted to do a deep dive into anachronisms in the Book of Mormon. There's been lots of, different apologetics on anachronisms. Matthew Roper's done a lot of work on it. I did an episode on anachronisms in my Book of Mormon series. And, a lot of the most common anachronisms that people bring up are things like horses or elephants, wheat, steel, chariots, those things not existing in ancient America during Book of Mormon times. For any listeners who don't know, an anachronism is something that's considered out of time or out of place. So the classic example is like Abraham Lincoln with a mobile phone or cell phone, as you say it in America. If you saw a picture like that, you would know this isn't an authentic picture because they didn't have mobile phones in his day. And a lot of critics would say that, these physical or, archaeological, metallurgical anachronisms disprove Book of Mormon historicity, and show that it's a 19th century text. And we're going to dive in and explore some of these anachronisms, and we're going to do 3 episodes on this. Part 1, we're going to focus on some of the physical anachronisms, maybe more so with the Jaredites and other things such as infant baptism. And then we have other episodes we're going to do exploring some of the other anachronisms, but this will probably be pretty thorough, and you've done a lot of research and prepared some slides. Is there anything you want to say in opening before we dive into your presentation?
No, just hopefully your viewers will find it that there's some new information, some new takes, some new angles. So again, this my specialty is really looking at things scientifically and linguistically, right? So I'm not so concerned with chiasmus or this other stuff, text. I'm just looking, and the anachronisms, obviously there's science involved, right? So it's appropriate.
And I don't know if this is part of your presentation, but this is like maybe one thing to take into account is, Matthew Roper, the graph that he's done on anachronisms from when the Book of Mormon was first published. And there is, a lot of anachronisms, I think close to 200 he had on there that were read. And then, over the years, I think the most recent graph he had was in 2005, that a lot of anachronisms have now been found that are no longer anachronisms, or some which are maybe trending towards not being an anachronism. I think maybe like horses, for example, which is maybe a sign that with time, some of these things which were anachronistic no longer are, and some of the current ones, they may not be definitive anachronisms, and that we've not archaeologically excavated all that there is to find in Mesoamerica. Whenever I looked at, I think, studies of archaeologists, they said less than 1%. I don't know if that's how it is currently. So it shows that, okay, we may not definitely find all of these outstanding anachronisms, and there could be other explanations, such as loan shifting or translators anachronism, which you're going to get into but it's also recognizing that if we've not excavated everything, we could still possibly find it as well. So I just think that's an important thing to be aware of from the outset, because whenever I first encountered anachronisms, whenever I was first in my faith crisis, I kind of assumed that, well, we've probably excavated everything and there's no evidence of it, and recognizing that we could possibly still find it in the future.
Yeah, and I think the point that a lot of people miss is you have to actually people just generalize and say, well, this is mentioned here, so we're expecting it everywhere in Mesoamerica or something like that. But a lot of these, you have to say, okay, where actually were they? What was their population size at this point in time? So if you're not really looking in that particular area, you know what I'm saying? I mean, you can't necessarily assume, oh, so they had some animal or some crop that they were growing. Well, if they're up in highland Guatemala, it's totally different than down on the coast, meaning because under most models, land of first inheritance was somewhere along the Pacific coast. And also like metals, which we'll get into in like part three, same thing as were the metals available, even in the location they were at, that kind of thing. So you actually have to kind of get more into the detail of the geography before you can actually ferret out some of these things because it's like you say, oh, they're doing something in Israel, so you're like, okay, well, let's look in Egypt, right? Are they having it in Egypt? It's like, well, no one would do that, but it's not that far away, right? So I'm just saying that people are kind of just glomming and throwing all of Mesoamerica into it, and we don't have a ton of records that made it through, hardly any. So you do have to kind of use like Maya texts or things to hopefully have some general idea, but really to do a proper approach to anachronisms, you do have to consider the geography and the time period as well. And sometimes it may
Right.
be, oh, hey, this area we're not finding very much or anything, but some things may be available as trade items that were available other places. And if they're not using much of it, what would you expect to find? So
Yeah, I think that's a good point you raised to understand the context. And even if it talks about a certain item at one point in the Book of Mormon, that might just be in that specific location and at that specific time. We might assume that, okay, it would have been there, widespread and across the entire timeline of the Book of Mormon, but that might not be the case. So that's another thing to consider as well. And I've also thought about, like, in the Bible, there's also been some things which were considered anachronistic, such as lions for a very long time until lion bones were found. So certain things, even in the old world as well, were considered anachronisms and then have been found in recent decades. Steel swords as well in Jerusalem being
yeah.
found. So over time, some of these things are being vindicated. That doesn't mean we definitely will find all of these outstanding anachronisms, but it may also, be an example of it doesn't mean we definitely won't, and patience might be required.
Yeah, and there's also like linguistics, even in the Bible, like unicorns, for example. Well, if you look at the Hebrew, it can mean an ibex or an antelope of some sort. So I'm just saying, even stuff that people are laughing about in the Bible, oh, unicorns, right? But that was just they translated that way, maybe because they weren't really aware of that animal being utilized anciently. So they were just like, okay, what are they talking about here? And so they just translated as unicorn because they didn't know any better. Does that make
Right. And I
sense what I'm
remember one
saying?
example in Brent Gardner's book. He talked about when Lehi and his family were traveling through the wilderness and, the breaking of Nephi's bow. And Nephi's bow is a steel bow. And you kind of think about, how can a steel bow break? And he talked about in his book that steel bow, it's likely the same translation as in the Bible when it talks about steel, but steel was likely a wooden bow covered in like bronze or brass. And then that actually would make sense for if they went to a more arid climate, why the wood would then twist and break. So some of those things which appear like, well, this is clearly anachronistic, it's understanding that the translation as well.
Yeah. And there may also be some story behind the story, meaning some biblical typology or representations, for which I'm working on a book on that too. But essentially, you have like the bow, the wood that it would have been made of is a jujuba, which was known in land of Manasseh. That's what was used to make bows in Western Arabia, but it also, it kind of equates to Moses' staff. He went up on the mount, the top of the mountain by himself, didn't take his brothers, meaning there may be some Sinai kind of typology going on there as to why it was mentioned. And that wood was the same wood used in the crown, that they put on Jesus. So I'm just saying there may
Okay.
be some some other
That's
things
cool.
at play, right? That into the story that maybe why it's mentioned that way or described in a certain fashion, is because they're trying to do parallels or does
Hmm.
that make sense what I'm saying?
Well,
So
it's kind of new to me, but yeah, that's interesting. Sort of like the typology they might have been using. So yeah, we're gonna dive into your presentation. I think this is an important subject because anachronisms are one of the first big criticisms leveled against the Book of Mormon not being historical as well. I think it's one of the things that causes a lot of faith crisis, and I think there are still questions and challenges, and in some ways we have to have some humility as believers, and probably for yourself, for me the one of the reasons why I've been able to maybe work through some anachronisms is taking into account some of the evidence you see in favor. If there's no evidence to support, then you might not be satisfied by some of these apologetic reconciliations to some of the anachronisms. So I think some of the evidence in favor for the Book of Mormon, such as Old World geography convergences or Mesoamerica convergences, ancient names, the witnesses, all those things need to be taken into account as well in light of these anachronisms. But it's important to explore them and tackle them as well as you're examining the truth claims of the Book of Mormon.
yeah. And I don't really consider myself like an apologist in the standard sense of the term. I just do research that interests me, right? So I'm not, oh, I got to come up with something to defend. I don't care about that. I just do my research, which I find interesting, and then let people know about it. But I'm not out there just claiming that I'm, defending the church or whatever. I would be the last person they would probably pick, to defend, defend the church. I kind of come from
Well,
a
you're doing
rough.
a lot of great research, and I think it's important that we're platforming it as well. But I'm going to try to minimize my commentary too much so we can get through a lot of your presentation. I'll just interject if I have a thought or a question to ask, but we'll let you take it away. I'll just enable screen share.
Okay. Okay. Are you seeing the?
Mm-hmm. Oh, that's a cool opening slide.
Well, this is one of your PowerPoint AI.
Mm.
They suggest when you create PowerPoint now, they have like a AI that can generate. It just pops up, So
I think
I
you're
don't.
trying to do
I
some
don't
sort
really
of
take.
hypnosis on us here, Jerry.
It was one I thought was cool, but they gave me, 5 to pick from. I thought this was interesting. So
Okay.
okay. So again, this is more of a discussion. I'm not like pretending to defend the church or anything. And, like you say, some of them are questions that I don't know that we have answers exactly to, but I think some we do pretty well. So let's get into it. First of all, part of what you have to figure out is you have this text, this ancient text, right? And again, the presumption is, I mean, there's 2 lines of research people can do. You either say, okay, my presumption is that the Book of Mormon is an ancient text, and I'll approach it from that when I'm doing my research. Others say it's not, and they approach their research showing that it's Joseph Smith wrote it or something like that. The Book of Mormon doesn't really provide you this really much middle ground. It's either you have to accept if you're saying historicity, you have to accept there was divine source and all that. It doesn't leave you. It's not like the Bible where you can just it's his history. Well, it's like where the genesis of it. So people say, oh, you're just looking at it from this premise. You're biased. I'm like, well, it's not bias. It's just there's really only 2 lines of research available for the Book of Mormon. Either if you're going to do research on its historicity, you have to presume it is a historical text and go from there. It's not, and that's what I'm saying. I'm not out here trying to prove the Book of Mormon this way or that. I'm just saying if you assume, if your presumption is it's a historical text, then you do research based on that. If you don't, then you're doing research saying it's not, right?
So I can
There's
I
a
can hear one quick pushback a critic might give, and you're probably going to address this throughout this presentation. But you're saying that some of us we might come to examining the text with sort of this presumption that either it's historical or it's not historical, sort of depending upon your sort of your bias or your worldview going in, and then you determine anachronisms from that way. I could hear critics saying, well, the anachronisms show it's not historical, so that's why they would take that position. What would just be your quick response to someone who would say, well, no, the anachronisms, that's what shows it's not historical?
Yeah, and that's what I'm saying. That's their line of research, is trying to show these aren't. If you're looking at it saying it is, then there may be some explanation that or maybe they're assuming things that aren't really in the text or implied by the text
Mm,
or part of the translation, right? And of course they'll just say, "Oh yeah, you're just creating this to justify." It's like, well, no, you're approaching it saying it's historical. There may be explanations we're not seeing, obvious, or they may be making assumptions about what the text says that aren't correct as to what the text says. I mean, there's lots of levels. So I'm just saying, when people approach this, they always say, well, you're biased, right? You're confirmation bias. It's like, it's not confirmation bias. It's just when you're doing a scientific investigation of the Book of Mormon, you have to, if you presume it's not a text, ancient text, you're not going to do this kind of research. If you presume it is, I'm just saying, if that's the presumption, then we do research and see if it's consistent with being a historical text, right? So,
right. And I
kind of
think as
these
well,
arguments, oh, it's biased. I'm like, well, that's anybody doing research on the Book of Mormon, you're either looking at it as a historical text or not. There's not much middle ground. There is a little bit where some people say, well, it's not historical, but it may be revelation or inspiration of
inspired
stories.
fiction.
Right. But I'm just saying, so if you're looking at any of my research, the presumption is it was an ancient text, and so we're looking at it in that context. You may disagree with the presumption, but to say it's confirmation bias, well, no, that's the premise of the research. You wouldn't be doing research. So
And I
this,
guess in
this,
a way, the best theory is the one that tries to account for all the data. So I guess, believers or faithful scholars, apologists would say, well, we do see maybe a growing body of evidence or connections or convergences to support, but then, okay, how do we account for, or what are possible explanations for these anachronisms or things that go against? Whereas an unbeliever critic, they might, focus on the anachronisms that they would see as disproving, but you also need to account for the positive evidence in favor. So it's trying to account for as much of the data as possible, which seems like what you're trying to do as well. Somebody who sees connections and evidence for the Book of Mormon, but we need to account for anachronisms as well.
yeah, and I'm just saying. So I'm open to all kinds of points of view, but again, I'm just trying to stage. Meaning, my research is basically with the assumption that it's historical text. Other people are doing research saying it's not, and of course you have to deal with that. But it's not confirmation. It's not confirmation bias in to the extent that the research. It's the presumption is, if you're going to investigate, you have to presume that it is a historic text, or why are you even basing? Why are you doing research on it? You know what I'm saying? And so, does that make sense? What I'm saying? It's
Yeah.
not. Yeah, and so these accusations of confirmation bias. I think, well, it's not really confirmation bias. It's just that's the premise, right? Is you're looking at it as a historical text. Because I'm not trying to prove one way or the other. I'm just saying, if you're going to do research, you either have to, because the Genesis of the Book of Mormon is unique, right, to say the least. Um, you have this presumption. If you're doing the research that's historical, you presume that it is a historical text and do your research based on that. So, I mean, just saying that, I just see commenters all the time saying, "Oh, it's confirmation bias." I'm like, "Well, no, it's just that's the premise of the research." So it's not necessarily bias. It's just saying that is the premise, and so then you do research based on it. It's not. You still, the bias would be, oh, you're only selecting scientific things, and I'm like, no, I'm looking at everything. I just look at the text. So
Okay.
I may not clarify it very much, but so one thing is you have this text in the Book of Mormon. I also did translation for 30 years from various languages, so I've had experience as a translator. But when you're translating or looking at historical texts or works, anachronisms can arise um, when the translator uses modern terminology or concepts, right? That would not have been relevant to the original context. So if you're translating into a particular target language, which is English, right, of some sort, there are going to be probably terminology that you have to put in a different form or different context. So I don't think any translation of an ancient text is going to give you is there will be some anachronistic expressions, right? So
What kind of makes you think of in the King James Bible? This was a seminary scripture mastery, which I did memorize actually in my New Testament year of seminary about, year of the light of the world, a city that is set in a hill cannot be hid, neither do men light a candle and put it under a bushel, but on a candlestick. And candlesticks would have been anachronistic. They wouldn't have existed in Jesus's day. But that was a modern 17th century translation by the King James Bible translators that it would have been oil lamps, but they used candlesticks because that was more familiar to them and their audience. But that doesn't mean that, the book of Matthew is a 17th century text, but it's a translation of an ancient text.
yeah,
Using
and that's an
modern
example of
vocabulary.
where you're going to get those kinds of things if you're putting it in a different time period, right? And you may just pick things that people will understand that they don't understand, would not be understood very easily by the modern people if you're trying to. And some of these are cultural, right? Meaning you have to understand the whole underlying culture for some of the phrases to even know what they're talking about. So just some sort of anachronism per se does not necessarily disprove a historical text. You have to look into what it is, and maybe it's a translation type anachronism.
Because I've
So
heard that criticism a lot that, oh well, one anachronism just disproves even if everything else looks legitimate, if you can find that one anachronism. I don't know if you watched the Mark Hoffman episode whenever the detective who was looking at the documents he created, and there was something about the ink being cracked, and it's like he found one thing and that sort of disproved it being authentic. Like, what do you think about that? Because some people take from that, then, oh, it's the same with the Book of Mormon or ancient texts, find one anachronism and that's it.
well, and I'd say that's true if it's something that obvious, right? In terms of, they're looking at this forged document. I'm just saying when you're dealing with an ancient text, you got to be careful about translation, right? The Hoffman thing, that was an anachronism that was not a translation issue. It was just the ink that was used, right?
Mm,
And so I'm just saying in a text, if you're looking at something that says something that's anachronism, then it may be a translation function of the translation. Does that make sense? So it's a little different than the Hoffman,
right.
you know,
Okay.
and we're not blowing anybody up here either. So
Just people's minds by the end of this presentation.
right. So I'm just saying that's something you need to be aware of. This is not unique to the Book of Mormon, is what I'm saying. But and then like I said, I've worked many years as a translation, so you actually have these kind of historical anachronisms, but you have to also know what is the translation. When people always use tied and loose, and we don't use that when you're doing translation, but you do look at target audience or target language, right? So if I was translating something, part of it's like I had a request. Okay, we've got this. I did a lot of technical stuff like how to operate a postal sorting machine, or did stuff on the jetways where you load onto airplanes. The thing that they you drive up to the door. And so the question is, you have this translation, and they would request, well, translate it into operator language, not the engineer language, because they're going to have to use this. The operator is not necessarily engineer. It's more simplistic. So you also have to say a translation may be different depending on the target language and also who's it tended for. So you may
Do you
have
think
different
literal
terminology.
and versus functional is a better way to put than type versus loose? Because like literal being more like trying to be more like word for
Yeah.
word,
It's
whereas
like when you see
functional.
Maya translated, if you're looking at the way that the academics translate it, well, you can't hardly read it very good because it's just putting each word out there. And then also it may be some cultural word. You don't even know what it's talking about. unless you understand all the surrounding culture, especially like gods or religion, that kind of thing. So, and you've talked about it before. So sometimes there's expansion, right? In order to like get people to understand it, you maybe have to expand on it, right? To explain
Mm.
the underlying setting. There also is all reductionist, right? I mean, there may be stuff that you say that's not really relevant, so I'm not going to include that in the translation because they would never understand what it's talking about anyway. And and that's kind of the same thing. Like when I'm translating for an operator, I'm not going to put the engineering equations that were utilized to develop, the motor. It's basically here's how you run the motor, right? I'm not, and so I'm reducing the translation for the intended um, audience, right?
Audience. Right,
Yeah,
right.
and so you have the Book of Mormon. You have to say, okay, I don't really know, but it does seem like okay, who's ever translating this? I mean, it wasn't really Joseph Smith, in my opinion. He was mostly reading it. Is they're directing it to what? Well, it's some worldwide population who's not going to all be PhDs, for example. So you may explain things differently to their level of understanding, right?
Right.
So some terminology you may just, well, I'm just going to put this. It's equivalent, not exact,
Yeah, kind of like a functional equivalent. Like it try to maintains the meaning, convey the meaning, but
Yeah,
it might be flexible in the vocabulary or grammar
yeah,
terminology.
exactly. So I'm just saying that's just known translation technique, that people use when they do translations of anything. So again, that's an issue you have to consider when you're looking at the Book of Mormon. That so, and again, so kind of the question is this for professors? Is it attempting to translate population for the vocabulary that even the poor people in Africa can understand when they're encountering the Book of Mormon? Because obviously, the intent of the Book of Mormon is not for somebody's PhD thesis, right? It's for utilization as a religious text enforcing certain belief sets, a testament for Jesus Christ, that kind of thing. So,
Mm-hmm.
and then you say, what's the target language, right? So you can, even in like if you're doing English translation, is this for British English? Is this Australian English? I mean, you actually have to select even within a language what your target language is, right? And more study that's done on the Book of Mormon, it's become obvious that it's highly using the King James Bible version English, right?
Right.
And sometimes they say, oh, well, that's translated incorrectly in the King James Bible. It's like, well, again, they're not necessarily trying to correct some error in the King James Bible version. They're just utilizing because that's what people are familiar with. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
So,
Yeah.
and then it looks like with also early modern English seems to be an underlying structure and grammar, that kind of thing, for whatever
Am,
reason.
am I right in thinking, when the Dead Sea Scrolls were being translated, that often like modern translators would utilize the KJV in the language unless the scrolls differed from it? Then they would go, with obviously, uh, the difference in the words, but when it kind of lined up, they would translate it similarly with King James Bible vernacular because that's just what's familiar to people.
Some did, and sometimes they look at the Masoretic text or something. I mean, the Septuagint. I'm just saying that they're all these different, and they're different, right? Because they were different translations for different target audiences. There's reasons why they translated those differently, certain elements of them. So it's not like people think it's like translating is this exact science, like 3 + 5 = 7 or 8 or something. It's there is some flexibility in terminology, that kind of thing.
I think
So I'm
that's
just saying that
important.
you have to keep that in mind when you're looking at any of these textual terms. I'm not saying that you can't, it doesn't mean you can't explain it, but you do. Some people are just making these assumptions about translation that are incorrect, and they just always say, "Oh, that means this." It's like, well, that's what you are interpreting the text to mean, but that's not the only take on the text, right? So
Right. Yeah. No. It's understanding the nature of translation because I don't think the Nephi authors would have been writing or speaking in King James Bible, but that is just how it has been translated into our language today. And some people would say, "Oh, well, the fact that we have King James Bible passages or language or variations shows that it's therefore a 19th century text, but its understanding it could still be a translation.
Yeah. And honestly, it is a 19th century text in the terms of translation. I mean, they're putting it in, they're translating it in the 19th century, right? So,
Right.
that's, it's not that it came from there, but that's what the translation target is. They're not going to, but curiously, it looks like they are not necessarily indicating 19th century text uniquely. They're going back to early modern English, which was earlier in some form. So it's a complex translation of which I don't know all the reasons that the translator may have done that, the divine translator, but that's kind of what we're finding. So, and it's the King James Bible stuff. It's not just copying it. It's actually in these paraphrastic phrases all through it, kind of dovetailed in. It's actually very complex the way they're incorporating King James Bible stuff.
Yeah,
So
it's not just verbatim passages, but there's lots of phrases as well from the older New Testament sort of scattered in as well.
yeah, and they're using it like only in part of the sentence, right, or something. So it's highly dependent on King James Bible version English, and so you have to keep that in mind,
Okay.
and how it applies to, let's say, animals. And one of the things that, well, I don't think anyone's really pointed out is if you look at all the animals listed in the Book of Mormon and the plants, they're all found in the King James Bible. That word, those words are found in the King James Bible version. So it's clear that there seems to be some influence. They're actually in the translation when they're looking at these things, they're utilizing the animal terminology from the King James Version Bible. So you may expect that maybe they're just using that term. It may be an animal that's close, but not exactly the same, that type of thing. Because they're actually, clearly they're deferring to biblical terminology when they're looking at these things. So it may be okay. The original writers maybe because they actually had access to the Bible, parts of the Bible too, right? So they're trying to use maybe glyphs or other things, like you say, maybe loans, but maybe in their religious text they're trying to stay within biblical terminology. Or it could be the divine translator is preferring to just use those. So you have to keep that in mind, as a potential explanation for some of these.
Okay.
And again, here's just the flora, agricultural terms. Again, they're all the ones used in the Book of Mormon are found in the King James Version Bible. So you're not finding, and if there isn't, it's like they're keeping it like Sheem or Nias, curelum, cumem. There are terms that aren't, but they seem to be being constructed probably based on an understanding um, of a new animal or something like that. The translator is putting those in because they don't have a King James Bible version word that matches it. Does that make sense? So,
Okay.
um, there's also some literary things you have to look at. Things called couplets, kennings. They're metaphors. These are phrases that you find in literature, also parallelisms that where they're using a term that means something. It's if you're taking it literally, it doesn't mean what it's meaning. It's actually referring to something else. So, and that's what a canning is where they use one or two terms that, like, I have an example, Wales Road. What is that? Well, that just means the sea, right? And you can see where they get that, but if you're just looking at that literally, it doesn't mean a road,
Right.
right?
Kind of like a
And
figure
then
of speech.
right, and so like even in Aztec poetry, you have eagle and jaguar. It mentions the eagle and jaguar. That just means warrior. And the reason is you have to understand the cultural context because they had different classes of warriors based on animals. So, but if you don't know that, you're like, well, an eagle and a jaguar, what are they talking about? It's actually talking about a person, not an animal at all. And I'm just saying, so you have to keep that in mind. And it seems like there are terms like they use silver and gold and silver, not everywhere, but often it looks like it's just saying valuables, right? Um, it's not necessarily implying that, oh, they had silver and gold. They're just saying, oh, they took their silver and gold and all their other valuables. It's just another term for valuables. So it doesn't necessarily mean that every single person had a stockpile of silver and gold, you know. So you have to keep that in mind. There are some literary constructs you have to look at as potential. And then you also have the naming of an original group's native language when encountering unfamiliar items. We often hear the example of hippopotamus means horse of the river in Greek. So they're obviously using horse. They're encountering a new animal. They're applying their own terminology to it, constructing a name.
This is known as loan shifting.
Yep, exactly. And I think
Isn't it
that's
true when the Spanish came, was it the Aztecs that called their horses deer? Something like
yeah,
that? Because
they call them
they're
large deer. They call them
right.
big deer. Yeah. Yeah, because again, they're like, well, what is it? We don't really have a word for it, but we'll just construct it based on a term we have and then modifying it a little bit.
So this is something that like ancient peoples, have done when they've encountered new animals that they're not familiar with. They would just give a lone shift or call it something, that they're more familiar with. Kind of like what you said with I think bison and buffalo is, a typical example as well. And yeah, like, the hippo being called river horse.
Right. And I think what I'm saying is their preference is King James Bible version name. So that it does look like they are limiting when they do their loan shift. They're not creating really new words. I mean, they are in a certain sense in the Hebrew, but then you see it left in its original some form that you can figure out, like curelam and cumem or sheem and nias. So I'm just saying they may actually say, well, we don't. There are some that they have maybe created a name for, and that those seem to be left in a different. So they're not using an English. There's not loan shifting. They're actually trying to create a new word, or, which we can try to figure out what they are based on the structure of the word or the
So
etymological meaning. So
So I just want to hit on that just to clarify, so I'm fully understanding what you're saying. That you're saying that some of the name of some of the animals in the Book of Mormon might be a lone shift from the Nephites, or possibly, you're saying that a lot of these animals also show up in the King James Bible. So this could be also, accounted by the translator as well. So either of those two. But you're saying things such as curelums, cumems, was it nias and shum, that they could be potentially. Are you saying like either maybe like transliterations that maybe they weren't given a lung shift by the Nephites or Jaredites, or this was
yeah,
a
I
name
don't.
that they gave to them that we wouldn't find in the King James Bible? Can you just clarify what you mean?
Yeah, I don't think it's transliteration that's going on. It's calques, which is a calque is where you take the term from the original language, what the meaning is, and you put it in your own language, meaning, you know, which they did in Mesoamerica a lot. So they're not borrowing in it like pizza, like we say a pizza. Well, that's just taking the Italian name for it and transliterating it into English, right? That's a transliteration. They're taking the meaning of it. Um, you could have like pigs in a blanket, right? That's a kind of food. Well, they wouldn't call it pigs in the blanket or whatever. They would translate into like an Italian porco in la coperta or something. They would actually just take the meaning and then put it in their own language. Does that make sense?
Oh, so you think that's what they might be doing when it comes to
Yeah.
curulums, cumems, or nias and
hmm
shum?
I'm pretty sure because I can actually show that, and they're standardizing it. So they're just saying, okay, in Sumerian that we know, or Hebrew, biblical Hebrew, or maybe Egyptian, they're standardizing it because it's a term over 1,000 years. It may have been spoken differently over 1,000 year period. So you can't really transliterate. It depends on what period of time you're trying to target if you're doing a transliteration, right? English is the same because pronunciations in English have shifted. Um, I mean, you try reading Beowulf, I can't even hardly understand it, right? And
Because one explanation I had heard for curulums and cumems is that, oh, well, this is in the Jaredite record, and it was Moroni who translated the Book of Ether, and maybe he didn't translate those words into Nephite language, so it just was transliterated from what it was in, the Jaredite language, which is why we have, curulum and cumem, like these strange words, which we don't know what they were because the Nephites didn't translate it into their language.
Yeah, and I think what I've shown in other publications is curulum is kura, that means sheep, or I mean a mountain. Eliam means sheep, so kuralam in Sumerian constructed means mountain sheep, which looks like an alpaca. And then kumam, ku is um, mountain, mom is beast. So I mean plow, excuse me. So you have plow, beast, looks like a llama because there are examples of llama being used, and when the Spanish came of using kind of to plow fields. So I'm just saying those terms seem to be pretty straightforward as to because we know they're animals. Those are that's Sumerian language. They constructed in the Jaredite language those terms, but so that seems to be, yes, those are Jaredite terms that have made it through the translation. The Nephites may have had a different name for those animals, probably did. Because one thing that's happening you have to consider is that the Jaredite record, the Nephites did not have access to that when they were generating their names for different animals, right? So it's independent of sort. As a culture, they may have been using loans as well, but they would not necessarily be the same loans. Does that make sense what I'm
That's quite
saying?
interesting that those two names have like those sort of like Sumerian, like would you say Sumerian sort of like roots or connections?
Yeah, they're
Um,
compound. They're compound names in Sumerian. So um,
that would have been, the rough area if you believe that, obviously assuming the Jaredites were historical, coming from that sort of region or area in
mhm.
Mesopotamia.
Yeah, exactly. So I think we can establish that. And Shiam is also similar. You can find that in Sumerian constructed, and Nias too means a form of tree, probably. And that is one maybe has a little bit of similar meaning because Nij is like a Mayan term for chili peppers. And so I'm just saying there may be some that actually have a little bit kind of match the translate. I mean, it's not transliterated, but it actually you can find a little bit of it. Anyway, so that kind of gives you the point I'm trying to make is that when you're looking at the Jaredite stuff, which we'll look at the animal issue as to what they're describing it as. I'm not talking about the Nephite stuff because that may be different. Cordalam and Cumam may have names different than that in the Nephite record, right? Because they didn't even have they would have already got their naming designations done because they're 500 years into their history before the Jaredite record is even discovered and translated, right? So, so it's and Ether is also it's way back. So even Ether himself, maybe having to kind of construct something from an animal that's no longer present, in his culture.
Okay.
Anyway, so we'll look at the Jaredite animals as we're talking. I mentioned this here. The Mulekites Nephites were maybe not even aware of the terminology when they got it. And the animals listed, I'm just going to deal with the animals, Jaredite animals, cattle, oxen, cows, sheep, swine, goats, horses, asses, elephants, curelums, and cumems. We know the Jaredites brought animals, right? So then we have to look and say, well, what of these were available for them to bring? It looks like all of them, except for curelum and cumem, or things that they brought from the old world. That's kind of what the text indicates. Um, so they brought flocks and herds and other beast animals. And then the vessel was compared by Ether to Noah's Ark in a way. It was tied into like Noah's Ark. So there's almost kind of this concept that they were kind of again, a biblical typology going on here of putting two animals in or something like this. And then you have to look at the time this was listed is this is about 5 generations from their arrival. So assuming at 2600 BC, this time frame for identifying these animals was like 2300 BC, so pretty far back. And the one question that arises is, well, what about elephants? Because that's considered, this anachronism because elephants, mammoths, and mastodons would have died out. I'm just saying, well, the reality is elephants may be one of these animals that they brought with them because they were known to be domesticated at least by 2500 BC in the Indus Valley, which is close to where they came from, because it says they came down into the valley in Sumeria, which would be from the east, which is closer to the Indus Valley. So I'm just saying this is And I don't think they brought them on the initial part of their journey, but when they get to where they have the final launching, the 4 years, and they're building the ships, the way I have laid out the geography, they're probably in the Canary Islands, which are visible from West Africa, so they would have had access. And in West Africa, there are actually the smaller elephants called the forest elephants. So they're smaller. Um, and if they're going to domesticate, they take them when they're young. And after 2 years, they're weaned, and they're not that big. They weigh less than an ox would, like 1,600 pounds. So if they're taking oxen, they could take these as well.
Right.
And so, so you don't have to necessarily look for the native. We'll look at that issue, but there's no reason they couldn't have brought them with. Kind of food wise, I mean, I figure that they did stop maybe in the Cape Verde Islands or went along the coast of Africa before they took the trade winds over. And because it says they were so many days on the water, but that doesn't mean they were all the time on the water. It's just that's a total number of days they were on the water. So probably like 200 days to get, to take that long stretch from the Cape Verde Islands over to the Caribbean. If you look at the feed for an elephant of that size, you could fit it all in like 10 by 10 by 10 space or even smaller. That'd be hay and grass if you're using bark, which they like. And then also in the wild, elephants have been seen to eat fish. They
Oh,
just kind of use their trunk and flip them on the shore and then eat them, pick them up with their trunks and eat them. So, which fish would have been available too. So, and the other thing about elephants is it like only 50% of what they eat is really digested. So you have antelope and other animals actually eating their droppings. Um,
lovely.
so yeah, I mean, people don't realize the same with, I grew up on a farm. We had horses and pigs. So pigs will eat the horse manure because not all of it's digested. Yeah. Yeah, not
I didn't know
tasty.
that.
Yeah, and so I guess what I'm saying is even your elephant droppings could be used for food for the other animals that they've got. So
Hey,
I don't think
recycling.
yeah, I don't think food is an issue of packing food into one of these barges for two elephants, two juvenile
Just eat the
elephants.
poop. So
Yep.
see those animals listed in Ether 9, are they listed as animals that the Jaredites had or animals that the Jaredites found in the promised land or
Well, it doesn't really designate. It just says they had them. I'm kind of asserting it sounds like these are still. It's not too far removed from when they arrived. These were still the old world animals that they brought with.
right. So you're asserting rather than them being native in the promised land in the Americas before the Jaredites came, you're saying that you believe most of these were probably
Yeah,
brought with them by the Jaredites.
except for the curelums and cumems. That's why they
Right.
right. So
Okay.
and then if you again you have to look at it. Here's I'm just showing you the forest elephant size versus the other two species of elephants. They're smaller. This is the Savannah I couldn't find like a chart for this for the forest element, but you can see they don't reach maturity till they're 50 years old, the biggest, So when they're small, they're actually a lot smaller than a full grown elephant. If you can see that chart kind of. So they're basically like only 4 feet tall after 2 years. So not really that difficult to put on a ship.
Hmm.
Which is, again, I'm not sure why nobody has really, they've always just assumed, oh, these must have been already there. I'm like, I don't think that's a good assumption to make. I think the text indicates that they came with, they were one of the animals that came with, consistent with all the other animals listed.
So I remember whenever I did a video on anachronisms and whenever I was looking into elephants, what's your thoughts on the lone shift? I think it was Wade Miller and Matthew Roper gave that possibly elephants could be a reference to mammoths and that
Yeah,
there might have been
I'll
some
talk
that
about that.
might
Yeah,
have,
well,
existed until sort of Jaredite times.
yeah, and I'll look at that possibility too here in just
Okay.
a second. I'm just saying
Okay.
that's not my primary look. I mean, I just don't think. I think this explains. This is what the text is explaining better. Um, then the other thing is, okay, so what happened to these animals, right? It seems like ether. They weren't around when ether was around because he's having to explain in the text that these animals we were eaten by people, and these animals were just used by people. So he's like having to explain these animals. Well, if they were around, people would know what they ate, that you ate them or not. Does that make sense?
Mm,
So in the story that he's telling or recounting, it doesn't seem like these animals are around, maybe curelums and cumems perhaps, but it does seem he's trying to explain something about, as if people don't know about the animals that are talked about way back.
I suppose unless you think he's writing to a future audience and future generations who might not
Yeah.
know, but you're reading that as you think that the reason he's explaining that is because some of those animals weren't around in his day for him to
Yeah, and
differentiate.
I'm kind of, what I'm saying is the text actually says that they didn't survive.
Oh,
If you look 2 generations after, you have the Great Dearth, the Heth event, where it says all of the animals that they had were devoured or killed, died or in the drought. So, you have the snakes chasing them, but it's clear he says that they all died. So I'm just saying, I think the text says that.
oh,
Right.
I don't even remember that detail. Do you have the chapter
Yeah,
that
it's
happens?
Ether 9:30 to 34 is the Heth event,
Oh,
which actually corresponds very good chronologically with what's called the 4K worldwide drought that knocked civilizations out, and you actually see evidence of that drought in the cave records, cave studies in Mesoamerica, specifically Mexico, and the Tuxtlas where they would have been located. So I'm just saying, Ether tells you that they all died. So
so do you believe all of the species that were on the previous list in that passage died, or are you just referring
yep,
to elephants?
no, I think they all died. So,
Oh,
but curelums and cumems maybe survived because they were native. They were other places, right? They weren't. They were, in South America. They were all over the place. So those ones probably didn't. All the ones they had died, but there was other populations of those out there, right?
hmm.
Whereas we're just, if they brought these animals from the old world, there's only a few hundred people, the generation couple generations before, so maybe you had 350 people that they're keeping these domestic animals. So it's not even a large number of animals. You wouldn't expect. They're not all that widespread. They're just limited to the area that they're living in because they brought them and they've been raising them. Does that make
Uh,
sense?
and one question on in the previous slide, it talked about they brought horses as well. Do you interpret that the Jaredites, when it says in the Book of Ether they brought horses, that it
Yeah.
actually is a horse that
Yeah.
was brought? Okay.
Right. Yeah, I'm not, because I'm saying you have to look at the Jaredites differently than from what the Nephites may have called things, because they generated differently. They were different culture. They came earlier. The Nephites weren't aware of their terminology until they got the plates of ether. Yes, it may have been translated differently. We don't know how Mosiah translated those terms, but so what I'm saying is you have to look at those specifically to say, hey, there's the old, they said they brought animals from the old world. These are animals that they're listing from the old world or known in the old world. Even elephants were domesticated, right?
Hmm.
So
Okay, so you're saying that you view some of these old world animals being in this sort of like tight knit area, that this wasn't widespread. This was brought over with the Jaredites. They weren't, found, throughout the land, in a very vast area. And then when that disaster struck, what was it? The Great Dearth occurred, that
of
many of these
Heth,
animals
yeah.
died.
Yeah,
Okay.
and it's actually, and there's a contrast there saying, look at Emer, he had all these animals. It was beautiful because they were all righteous. Heth was wicked, and look, they lost all their animals died. Meaning, so it's still a contrast of wickedness versus good, as we find throughout the Book of Mormon, right? The good people prospered, the other ones wiped out, and then you can arise the question, okay, you have this limited number of animals. Would you expect any of them to have survived outside of, escaped into the wild, right? Or
Yeah,
something like
migrated.
that. Yeah, but the reality is and that's one reason the forest elephants is a good candidate because they were in a tropical environment in Africa and they're existing in a tropical environment in Mesoamerica. So the climate is amenable to them as well. But then the question is, could they really escape and survive? Could a domesticated animal be expected to survive, even an elephant in Mesoamerica? It's like, well, no, there's so many predators there. How would they survive? A limited number, probably not. I mean, there's pumas, there's jaguars, there's crocodiles. It's like that, and then there's
Would they take on an elephant? Maybe like a young one, but I wouldn't
yeah,
have thought an adult one.
yeah. Elephants get pride of lions takes down elephants and can.
Hmm.
So yeah, and they're honestly they could have all died from some disease that came along that they weren't resistant to. And then there's kind of a rule of thumb among biologists. It's called the 10% rule of thumb that of non-native species, only like 10% can even survive in a new environment. That's assuming there's no predation and that kind of thing. And then really only like 1% would become things that would expand or be considered invasive, right, to actually spread. So it's consistent with what the biologists say that if you drop some animals in a new place, they're not most of them. There's not an expectation that they would survive in the new environment,
So
especially once they're not domestic. I mean, if they're not receiving assistance from humans to feed them, that kind of thing.
am I right in what you're trying to say is that you see a lot of these animals listed in the Book of Ether were brought over, with the Jaredites, they brought them over to the New World, and that approximately after about 150 years, when this great dearth happened, that's when a lot of them died.
Yeah, a
And
little long,
wouldn't
like about 400 years, right, since they arrived. But
oh,
yeah, and when
400
we
years.
know the population was reduced of people to, it said 30 people survived the war of Achish, when they fought, plus the family of Omer who had fled, and so that's all that was left of the Jaredite. So what would you expect? Not that many animals to support 150 people, or something. So you're not talking this huge population of animals, of domestic animals, at the time, because the population is very small and in a very limited geographic area, right? So
Okay.
again, you have to say, what would you expect? Not that many. Again, I'm just relying on the text, for the, and what the text says.
I really need to reread the Book of Ether to be a lot more familiar with these details.
Well, and most people don't read it, for that. They're looking for the spiritual, and inspiration. They're not really caring what a,
That's what I've been doing wrong all this time.
well, it's okay. I'm just saying it's just when you get into the details, when you're looking at someone asserting an anachronism, you say, okay, now we need to look at the text. What does it actually say about that animal?
Uh-huh.
You know.
Okay.
So here's the other approach. You can say, well, they were talking about elephants that were mastodons or mammoths. Where is this? Where is the scientific position now? Now there's been what's called eDNA research, which is basically taking soil and you have residual DNA fragments, and they use kind of supercomputer. They can now generate and figure out what DNA is existent, and that would be from droppings or dead animals. They're able to do it up in the Arctic because you have permafrost that's preserving these things. So you can't really do that. It's difficult to do that study elsewhere, but it's now pushed elephants way into the past the Pleistocene, into the Holocene. In Europe, it's as late as 2000 BC they were existing in central Siberia.
Hmm.
North America, the studies at least now are 6600 BC, so it's moved from 12,000 to now 6600. Still not to exactly Jaredite times,
But
but
pushing closer.
yeah. But the reality is too is if you're saying you have this, animals just don't go extinct in 10 years, right? Even modern with the human, it's like, so you have these islands, and especially if you have some domesticated ones, they're not going to be, because that's the main premise is that humans came and because not all a lot of animals survived. Buffalo. There's not every animal got hunted to extinction during this time frame. So especially if you have some domesticated, semi-domesticated animals, well, they're not going to be hunters aren't going to be slaughtering them because the people want to keep them alive because they're using them. So so yes, I'm just saying I think that studies would show that there could have been an island population, a small population. When the Jaredites came, there was still some island, some small population in certain areas, and then they domesticated them, and so then they would have kept them further, because they wouldn't have gone extinct again until like the Heth event. Then maybe that's what wiped out the rest too. So
And quick question, because obviously you've done way more research than me on this, but like growing up, whenever I'm probably like in recent years, as I've read curelums and cumems, always the thing that popped into my mind was a mammoth. Is there any basis to that being a possibility? Looking at the Sumerian, that it could be referring to, domesticated, mammoths if they existed at that time, or probably not.
probably not. And also, when they give the list of animals, they list them separately from elephants, so they probably wouldn't have listed them twice.
Hmm.
Does that make sense? Because curma and cumoms are mentioned in the same verses as the
As
elephants.
elephants. unless they
Yeah.
differentiated them from elephants. But oh, okay, that's fine.
Yeah. Or maybe a different kind of elephant, I guess, maybe perhaps. But
Mhm.
that's why I'm saying it seems to be animals something different than what they're listing. And I'm saying llamas and alpacas match the etymology of it. And they were also known to be domesticated in Mesoamerica. Not so
Okay.
much now. I mean, there were now you don't have alpacas or llamas, but back then there are like depictions, ceramic depictions of llamas found archaeologically. Alpacas were actually found in the Isthmus of Tehuantepec when they were surveying for in the 1800s for a railway to cross, what they're still doing now to bypass the Panama Canal. So their range seemed to have been up in Mesoamerica in ancient times. Well, there's not like a ton of archaeological evidence for the alpacas, but again, the Jaredites were way back.
Okay.
And then I'm going to look at swine just because that's one that was mentioned among the Jaredites is not really mentioned among the Nephites except by inference in Third Nephi, where it talks about you know pearls before swine.
Oh,
So
so pigs aren't listed as an animal among the Nephites?
no, except in inference where Jesus is talking, is preaching. They are, and so you'd say, well, okay, they're maybe not, which is consistent with them being not an acceptable animal under the law of Moses to eat. But there's a pretty good, if you call it a loan, it's not even really a loan. It's just peccaries are basically look like pigs. They're from
Yeah,
the
it's a type of
swine.
pig.
Yeah, they're from the swine family. They're not exactly from the same, you know, genus as the old world swine, but and then one of the criticisms of, well, hey, they were never domesticated. It's like, well, the Book of Mormon just says that they raised these animals, not swine, but they just raised them, which can be all kinds of. It doesn't have to mean that they bred them, but it's actually been shown that when the Spanish arrived, they were catching the baby peccaries and then raising them for food, pen them up and raise them, right? So they weren't doing breeding, but they were still catching animals, raising them, and then eating them. And
And,
then,
and I think it's really fair to grant that, like, if, like, considering swine to be an anachronism in the book more, like, I think if peccaries did exist, which are a type of pig, I think that's a pretty fair one to, like, maybe eliminate as an
yeah,
anachronism, because we would often think of pig or swine, the pig that we would see at the farm. But yeah, I think this is totally reasonable to be
yeah,
considered a pig or a swine.
yeah. And the Spanish called them wild pigs. That's when they found them. So it's not, and you find their bones in archaeological digs so that they ate them. So I'm just saying, again, this is one. I think you're right. This should just be eliminated because it's not, it's, it's not really like any stretch.
Yeah, no, it's not a stretch.
Right. And so again, I'm trying to deal with some of these that are more straightforward too. And I'm kind of relying on like the CES letter or Wikipedia anachronism page just to like I'm kind of going down those
To give you
lists.
the list. But
Yeah, so
that's
I'm not
good to
using the
realize,
map.
because I always had it in my head that pigs were spoken about throughout the Book of Mormon, not just with the Jaredites. So are you saying it was just specifically with the Jaredites?
Yeah, I mean there was a like I say when Jesus was teaching,
That
he
was it.
used them as a metaphor. Yeah, so I'm
It's a
saying okay,
metaphor.
they
Okay.
maybe still been around and they were familiar with what that term was instead of just being a King James Bible version. So I'm looking at it and saying, okay, we'll look at that. And they were around.
And I guess
And
under the law of Moses, they wouldn't have eaten like pig or pork.
yeah, and the reality was, okay, let's be honest, the Nephites weren't really mostly righteous during most of their time. So I have no doubt there were plenty of people eating them who weren't caring about the law of Moses, right?
Yeah, that's true. Okay.
Yeah, no, everyone's assuming that. They always look at the Nephites. Well, Nephites this. I'm like, well, the Nephites most of the time they were pretty wicked, so probably following pagan gods. Why would you expect them to be caring about the law of Moses? When they're killing all the people that believed in the law of Moses.
Okay, so that's fine.
Yeah, honeybees keeps being listed. Um, First of all, they were the Sumerians. I mean, first of all, they're mentioned in Ether, right, as part of Ether. But it only mentions them in the first part of specifically in the first part of their voyage, which was probably through the Mediterranean Sea to this wilderness beyond the sea, what they refer to it, which I'm saying looks like the Canary Islands is a good place for it. Had a tall mountain, he went to a mountain that had a cloud, which is, maybe a volcano that had some, you know, wasn't exploding at the time, but maybe had some degassing or clouds, that kind of thing. So it's not an anachronism in the sense that it's not specifically listed that they took bees with them. Even if they did, there were honey producing bees. Uh, there are in Mesoamerica. The Mayans keep them like a little, almost like pets, and they use them for the honey is it actually has medicinal uses, and so it goes way back. So yeah, there were what would be called honeybees in Mesoamerica. So it's not an anachronism either. It should just be eliminated as an anachronism. There's really evidence that the Sumerians had it, so that's where they came from. So they would be familiar. They didn't have the term for bee, but they had the term for honey and beekeeper and honeycomb. They haven't found the word for bee in Sumerian, but they have all these other words, and it shows that there's honey existing in the temples. So,
So
um,
you're saying that are you referring to the mountain that the brother Jared goes up on, where he, obviously communes with the Lord through the veil? Is that the one you're referring to, believing to be in the Canary Islands?
yeah,
Oh,
because there were different segments of their voyage, right? The first one, they
uh-huh.
went to the Valley of Nimrod, which looks like it's north, somewhere up in Turkey. In fact, they say that's where Nimrod was even now,
Hmm.
historically. And then they went across the empty quarter. This is if you're going to the Atlantic, which looks like the Syrian desert, which they would arrive at the Mediterranean. Then they took their barges out to this wilderness beyond the sea, which looks like, probably the Canary Islands, because that puts them in a position where the currents are favorable to get to Mesoamerica and the trade winds. That's what Columbus used, right? When he came, he went that way.
Right. This
And
is like southwest in Morocco.
yeah, right. And like I say, there are elephants available in West Africa right there. You can see Canary Islands from West Africa. So it would seem like they came that way, bounced along, maybe stopped in the Cape Verde Islands, that's along the route, and then maybe stopped in the Caribbeans to get food or something, and then finally landed in
I always thought
Mesoamerica.
most scholars thought the Jaredites went like through Asia over more to like the east,
Some people
towards
say
China.
that, yeah, but it doesn't, honestly, it doesn't make sense from even from a weather standpoint, because it says there were these tempests that they encountered, which is hurricanes, which occur in that area. Where if you're going the Pacific route, um, and it's difficult to get to Mesoamerica, you have to go clear north up into the Arctic almost to get to catch the favorable current. So yes, there's not a lot of information about their journey. So that's what some people are proposing. I'm just saying it seems much more reasonable. And also the Book of Mormon geographic models show they landed on the Atlantic, on the Atlantic side of basically in the Tuxtlas, just south of Veracruz. And that's where the Olmecs were. That's where the culture that matches the Jaredites were. So I'm just saying, if you're using Mesoamerican geography versus the description versus the easiest way, and there's a lot of assumptions people make. They're built like submarines. It doesn't say that at all. It just says they were looked like their barges slightly modified. They did a tight deck, so the barges didn't have a deck. So they put a sealed deck. So when they went out in the ocean, when they hit rough water, they wouldn't get swamped. But it's just these artists depict everything wrong, you know, and so people just get that in their mind. But you have to actually look at the text. So yeah, so
Okay,
the
and
first part of the journey to the Canaries looks like if the Canaries is correct, then it said they had bees during that, and you could expect they could do that because they're stopping along the Mediterranean at different places. The bees can go in, and you can keep bees alive. I had bees myself. You have to feed them sugar, water. They don't have to go get nectar. You can keep them alive with sugar water, but maybe they stopped and then the bees went out, and they weren't the. I mean, we don't know how long the journey took, right? That first part.
and you have here as well in the second paragraph that honeybees were found in Jaredite times in Sumer. No word for bee has been located in Sumerian, but there is a word for honey, and beekeeper and honeycomb exist
Right.
as well.
Yeah, it just means, well, they haven't found it yet. Probably there is that word, but you're limited to what
Yes, you
clay
would assume there
tablets are
would be if
discovered.
there's one for honey, beekeeper, and honeycomb.
exactly. And then there's indicated that honey was used in the temple, so they got it from somewhere, right?
Right.
And so I'm just saying. So again, whatever you look at the honeybee, it's not an anachronism in any sense of, meaning the text doesn't say they took them to the New World, and even in the New World, you have honeybees. And in fact, I'm kind of showing in the Sumerian deseret, which was the word they used, that is a Jaredite word. You can break that down and to carry, to sting, insect or bug, to go, to leave, water. So it actually matches a bee. The word deseret, if you break it down as a compound word in Sumerian, you can arrive at a bee, right?
So one question I have is, I'm trying to remember the scripture. Like, did it say that they carried them with them on their journey, the
Initially,
Jaredites?
the
Initially,
first the first part of the journey, they took them, yeah.
so I guess my question is, why did they take them for the first part of the journey, but then not take them to the promised land?
Probably because they're kind of hard if you're having to seal your deck.
Yeah.
And I'm not sure having a bunch of bees would be that fun and seal in an enclosed space. And you have to feed them, right? I mean, you can't stop. You're going to be extended on the ocean, so it's possible they may not even have survived all the way till the Canary Islands. Is what I'm saying. They carried them initially, but you know,
Okay.
because you can transport bees, but sometimes if you move their hive too much, then they can't come back to the hive, or you let them out. So there are problematic reasons why you wouldn't be able to transport bees in that fashion across the ocean. So
Yeah, it's just curious in my mind why they brought them like at all for even part of the journey. Like bees.
yeah, and I think part of it may have been that that they use this honey actually as a religious, not the original bees, but in Mesoamerica they did. So that may have been the wine that they used in the sacrament or something. They know they made honey wine. I mean, there may be some religious reason why they're using this term and is an important term, just like Shiam looks like amaranth, which they used. It's a red colored seed that they use for like almost sacrament. They make little wafers for their rituals. So there may be some reason why they're actually including these terms.
Hmm.
The Nephites are because it's a religious text that they're writing here, right? So
Okay, and you say the name of the word Deseret, quite a strong argument in favor for the Book of Mormon. It incorporates elements of the Jaredite honeybee story into the Sumerian words such as to carry, to go, to leave, and
yeah,
perhaps water. Okay, that's
and then
interesting.
a form of the Hebrew is also swarm. So it actually in both languages makes sense. Can refer to bees.
Hmm. Okay.
So it's actually it's not an attack on the Book of Mormon. It's actually supporting the Book of Mormon. When people assert this, I'm like, we're actually asserting something. If you're trying to show that it's an anachronism, it's actually not. It's actually supportive of the Book of Mormon when you look at the name Deseret and that kind of thing.
And this is a side note, but I remember watching a video, I think it was by Scripture Central, and they were talking about Jaredite names and Kish or like Akish and Replikish being names, among the Jaredites, and that Kish was a very popular name, I think, for a king and maybe even a city in
Mhm.
Sumer. Am I remembering that right?
Yeah, that's correct. It's also used in the Bible, mentioned in the Bible, Kish. But actually in Sumerian, it's interesting because like Akish, for example, the guy that started the secret society, the first part of the word A means power. Kish means in Sumerian means netherworld, secret. So it actually matches the guy,
Hmm. Okay, that's
meaning the
interesting.
names in the Book of Mormon are metonymic, meaning for the most part they are describing the person or features of the person or characteristics of the person or the place, which we know because they actually said, Ripiancum interpreted as many waters. So we're told these
Hmm.
words, these names have meanings. They don't tell them
Even
all, but
names of maybe some of the characters as well in the Book of
yeah,
Mormon.
pretty
I think
much.
Matthew Bowen's done a book on that and a lot of work on that.
Yeah. And I have a huge book on it too, where I've actually found new Hebrew stuff like him. It's like Josh. The word Josh, that's the name of the city that was destroyed by fire. Well, Josh in Hebrew means fire. So
Oh, that's interesting.
yeah, so there, I mean, there's almost all of them you can find meaning to.
Okay,
Okay,
so
the other one, another
glass.
allegation related to the Jaredite of alleged anachronism is glass, because it says they were described as white and clear, even as transparent glass. The rocks. Well, they're saying, hey, glass, transparent glass was not known to, you know, we have a history when glass making started at 3500 BC. So it's not making of glass is an issue, but it's they didn't really come up with a way to make transparent glass until way late, you know, um, first century AD. But there's the question is not whether they made the glass, is whether they were familiar with a transparent glass of some sort. And natural glass can occurs when you have a lightning strike in sand. Volcanoes can produce natural glass. When meteorites hit the earth, they form glass and transparent glass. So, and this is they call them like in Libyan, they call them desert glass, where they have all these over thousands of years. You have lightning strikes, so wherever the lightning strikes, it forms this transparent glass. They call them tears. So this is just a picture of transparent glass naturally occurring. So again, this isn't again, it's just showing it's not an anachronism.
Right. It's comparing the 16 stones that the Lord touched, were white and clear like transparent glass. So it's more like would they have been aware or familiar to
Yeah.
it, but it's not actually speaking about glass in the
Yeah,
book.
it doesn't mean they made the glass transparent. It's just they were aware of a glass that was transparent, and there were naturally occurring glasses which were known um, and collected even by the ancients. Does that make
Okay.
sense?
Hmm.
Yeah. So again, that's another not an anachronism at all. Compass. One of the issues that they list is hey, compasses weren't invented till the Chinese, so they're calling the Liahona compass, right? So why would they even use this term if they weren't familiar with kind of compass forms? But the response is the compass, or essentially a compass, was known to exist among the pre-Olmec 4,000 years ago, meaning there were these different carvings that they had that were magnetic rock, and they would carve them with features um, consistent with the poles of the magnets, so of the magnetic rock. So you have the magnetic pole on the snout. You've got a jaguar, sculpture where each the one paw is the north, one paw, is a pole of the magnet. So they knew where they were. They had a way of measuring magnetism um, way back among the Olmec. Um, Again, they had it, these fat boys, they'd put it around the navel. When they carve them, they make sure one of the magnetic poles is at the belly button. So I mean, I'm just saying that when they were carving them, they actually would look at the rock and measure the magnetism and then make the carving consistent with the magnetic poles of the rock that's magnetic that they're carving.
Okay, so you're saying 4,000 years earlier, the Olmecs would have been familiar with, some sort of like a compass. And again, you could say that this is also a translation as well.
Yeah, and it's pre-Olmec, even before the Olmec, they have
Mm.
carvings that they knew. So, and then actually they've actually found what they call a compass of sorts. It has a groove in it. It's magnetic. It would float. They'd put it in water on a piece of wood, and so it would align itself um, with the magnetic field of the Earth, right? Just like a compass does. And they actually figured they used it to lay out some of the cities, that kind of thing. So um, anyway, so they found equivalent to compasses, and these are not LDS people. These are just standard scientists describing these things, right?
Okay.
So so anyway, so that the compass, I think that's not an anachronism at all. I mean, there's plenty of evidence for it. Silk, they also raise silk. Hey, part of that's like, well, it's got to be silkworms, right, that are making it. Otherwise, it's an anachronism, and silkworms didn't exist in Mesoamerica. Well, They think there was a form of wild silkworm. They don't necessarily know that they were harvesting from it, but you don't necessarily need that anyway. You just need something that's kind of close to silk, right? To describe silk. And they made fine cloths made of, fibers from seed pods, from um, soft leaves of the wild pineapple, even the underbelly of rabbits, hair that was very fine. So you could get, it looked like silk. Um, and then you also had, there were two indigenous insects, the moth and a butterfly, that would make, similar to a silkworm, that made kind of a cocoonish type thing, which they could then be used, which they used to create a silk type. Um, and here's the example of they would harvest this and then create a cloth from it. So it's equivalent to silk. I'm just saying that that's again, essentially that's silk. It would be
Right.
described as silk as the nature of silk. If you looked at it and didn't know, you'd probably call it silk.
Okay.
Okay, then there are a few um, kind of cultural things that get raised. Um,
Yeah, particularly the chapter in is Moroni chapter 8, isn't it? About the
yeah,
baptism of little children. I was going to say infant baptism, but you corrected me that it doesn't say infant baptism, but little children. But that's often how it's referred to, and that's often a criticism is that, oh well, this is a clear 19th century element why there's no evidence of infant baptism occurring in ancient America.
yeah. There are a couple anachronisms I'm not really listing as a slide, and they're raised by people, LDS people that don't think it took place in Mesoamerica and say, hey, this is an anachronism. One is flax, uh, fine twined linen. And then they say, well, the definition of linen means it had to be made from flax. Well, that's only one definition. The second one is it just has to be, similar, looks like linen in the Webster's dictionary. So that's not really an anachronism. And flax is found in Mesoamerica anyway. So they're
Oh,
just, they don't know what they're talking about.
okay.
And then the other one they talk about is grapes. Well, hey, they had this, Noah was a wine bibber and had vineyards of sorts. And hey, grapes only occur in North America. It's like, well, no, they have wild grapes that occur in Mesoamerica. They've actually found grape seeds in refuse piles, and archaeologically, so they know they ate them and used them.
Oh yeah,
And
because
there's
it
a
talks about the Lamanites, being, drunk with wine
yeah,
when
and
uh
there's a
Alma and his
myriad
people
of
escape.
wines that they made in Mesoamerica from different fruits. So I mean, that's not an issue that there was alcohol available. In fact, I'm not even sure you show that in North America that they were fermenting it and that kind of thing. But in
So
Mesoamerica,
there's
you don't
evidence for
even.
that for wine and the fermentation of grapes in
Mm.
Mesoamerica.
Well, the grapes were there, and then when when the Spaniards arrived, there was different forms of wine. I'm just saying that the grapes existed, wines existed of some form. There's no reason why grapes could not have been used
Okay, the
similarly
resources
to
were
make
there.
wine because they were making it out of different fruits. So
Okay, so it's not really a strong like criticism or
no, yeah,
anachronism.
right. It's not at all.
Right. Okay.
So anyway, so let's get into the baptism issue. This will take a little bit of discussion. Um, I guess I zapped you out of.
Oh,
I can't see anymore by accident, but that's okay.
that's okay. I can still see you in the slide.
Yeah. So baptism is the question is one of the questions is, hey, this must be a 19th century, Joseph Smith writing for the 19th century because culturally, why there's no baptism historically, anciently that they would have been concerned about, right?
Right. This
So
would have been
in that,
concerned in Joseph's day because of infant baptism, in the Catholic Church. This is something that would have been a controversy, in 19th century American Christianity, uh, not something that you would find in ancient America.
yeah. But in fact, we do. This is out of the Dresden Codex, and we'll get into it. First of all, the epistle, it's found in this epistle, right? From where it's mentioned. And one of the questions is, in fact, what I'm saying is not only is it not an anachronism, it's actually evidence for the Book of Mormon, just the opposite of what people are asserting. Because Mormon, there's referencing disputations that arose among baptism of your children. He's talking, he mentions these are talking to people that have not yet been baptized. The parents have not yet been baptized. So why is this a disputation? It seems pretty clear that there was an existing form of baptism outside of what the church at that time was doing. Um, does that make sense what I'm saying? So,
Oh, so you're saying that some of this disputation is people that weren't among people that weren't in the church?
yeah, that's what he says. He says he's talking about these
Oh,
parents should accept baptism and all this, and baptism of the children is erroneous. So if you read it closely, that's clear. He's talking to some group that's not. He's referring to the people raising the disputations are non-members.
I didn't realize that. I always read and assumed it was people in the church.
Yeah, so if you read it closely, it's directed at the parents of the non-baptized people.
Oh, okay.
If Moroni 8, 10 through 11. So,
I'm gonna have to
um,
fact check you in this and read that chapter tonight. No.
well, read
Maybe.
it and you kind of see what I'm talking about.
Yeah.
And then um, the other thing is you don't really have righteous Nephites at this time. So who are we really talking about that they're preaching to? Some group of Lamanites. And from the epistle prior, where it's a sermon, Mormon refers to this peaceful, loving, they're peaceful. It seems like he's actually looking at some descendants of the anti-Nephi Lehi or people of Ammon, right? Um, so it's consistent with a Lamanite group that where the disputations are being raised, which and culturally that would be a Maya culture. The Lamanites is equivalent to Maya culture in at least the geographic model that I think is the most correct, the Grijalva model, the Sorensen model.
Mm-hmm.
Um, it's been noted by Gardner and Matt Roper too that there was a Maya practice of baptism, so we can look at that. And it was Diego de Landa Calderon, just referred to de Landa. He was kind of known both for good and bad because he was the one that burned all the Maya manuscripts. And but nonetheless, he actually document a lot of cultural and religious ceremonies when they arrived. The Spanish document what the Maya were doing. Um, so I list him. He was painted as a saint and also as a going to hell, depending on you know who you're talking to. So, but that's the source of the kind of the Maya baptism information. And this is quoting. It says basically the Maya have it. The word means, the word that they use in the Maya language means to be born anew, or be born a second time. So that's consistent with what we know of baptism, right? This ritual. Um, they uh, they basically, if they're devoted, they have to receive it. Give it for those guilty of sins. They have to confess to a priest before they get it. Um, and they didn't get it a second time. He was kind of you did it once, that was it. And
And
then
would
when
this
you
be like an immersion, or would it be like a sprinkling or a pouring?
it
Or
looks like they poured water, right? And so again, we're looking at a pagan form that existed. And that's kind of what I'm asserting is you actually had these people that they were preaching to that had a form of baptism. And that's one reason Mormon was so when he just went off on it, saying it's so wicked and all this stuff. Well, he wasn't just talking about some person that had some question. It was actually basically a competing pagan
practice?
religion practice, right?
Oh,
So so he's that's why he was saying it was such a bad thing. Um, they also believed that when you got it, you got a predisposition to do good conduct and habits, your protection against being harmed by the devils, and that if you did it in the afterlife, you would have maintain a good place where you consisted in eating and drinking and having everything. So it actually matches kind of the concept of baptism that we
so
even
you're
have.
saying that Mormons not responding to people in the church who are saying like, "Hey, we want to baptize our little kids or our infants, kind of like, what's on the Catholic Church, but this is this outside religion that is already doing this practice
Uh-huh. Yeah.
of baptism,
And
or pouring water richly on young children, and that's sort of the context that he's responding to. And there's evidence to support this occurred among, this was the Mayans.
yeah. And meaning um the disputation was probably likely, again, this is conjecture, is that they says, hey, our kid's already been baptized,
Mm.
and he gets all these protection from devils and all this. So why do we have to do your baptism? That kind of thing. It's kind of like the Catholics, they accept any baptism except Mormon baptism.
Oh, of
So
course, yeah.
I'm just saying it's not without precedent that, you have these different rituals that some may say, I already did that. I'm just saying that would be a possible disputation that, like, why do they have to do this again? Um,
And see,
and they
I
did it.
always would have thought, like, from reading, I'll have to obviously reread it really closely, this chapter, but I almost would have always interpreted it as people in the church almost wanting to adopt this outside practice of baptism into the church, and like, we should do it this way. And that's what Mormons sort of refuting against. But you're saying you see it more as it.
Perhaps I'm saying you could look. I'm saying there's not a lot of information there, but he's obviously responding. Moroni said there's some issue about it, and he's writing back saying, because he's familiar with it, right? He didn't have to go over there and talk to the people. He's already familiar with the issue.
Hmm,
You know
okay.
what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Meaning Mormon didn't travel there. He's like he knows all about this baptizing of young children. It's not a new thing to him. And he talks about it being evil, they're of the devil and all that. I mean, he's not right. I don't think he's ripping on particular members. He's ripping on a pagan religion practice that's prevalent in the area, right?
And I see down in the second paragraph, you said that they raised the children to the age of 3. That was
Yeah.
sort of the custom for preparing for baptism. So it's not like in the Catholic Church where it's, newborn infants that are being, christened, and this
Yeah. In
is
fact, and
this
in
is
fact,
actually 3-year-olds.
right. So it's not this infant baptism of the 19th century. And the word infant is used elsewhere in the Book of Mormon. So the word existed. But he never said infant. He said little children, right? So it's reflecting that practice that is going on. And it was, 3 all the way to 12. So probably some of them were old enough to be baptized. I mean, meaning it probably didn't violate the principle of that they were too young, because a 12-year-old is probably old enough. But he was saying for the young ones, these little children, it's not
They
correct.
don't need it, right?
Yeah. And
Okay.
I'm just saying, and I don't think it's only the issue of they were little. It's just he's kind of saying the doctrine is totally, here's the doctrine of why they're innocent and why this is a bad practice that's going on. Meaning that's what I'm saying. It wasn't just some member thought up, oh, okay, let's baptize infants or something. He's responding. He already knows the practice. He knows the surrounding practice. He knows the pagan practice that he's arguing against. And that's why he rails on it as a practice, not like, oh, that guy's just dumb. He doesn't know the doctrine, right? It's not some member that just doesn't understand the doctrine. It's a known practice. It's um, in populations they're preaching to.
Okay.
So
Well, that's quite
again,
important context.
yeah, and so I'm actually saying this is actually evident. The way it's described in the Book of Mormon is consistent with that, with the ancient practice, not with something in the 19th century, right?
Hmm.
Um, okay, it's also kind of they had to have it before marriage as well, um, and again, I've kind of talked about this. The most specific instructions given to the non-members, directed to the parents. They had some belief in baptism of these little children, erroneous as it was, and I kind of show that a lot of the pagan religion you're talking about is Lamanite stuff throughout the Book of Mormon. Um, then we're going to talk about circumcision too, because the comments also made that the law of circumcision is done away in me in Christ, and that's an interesting comment. Again, kind of evidence that this is not Nephite people we're talking about, not members of the church, because the law of Moses was done away with 300 years earlier amongst the
Hmm.
Nephites. So it's like this is some apostate practice that's still continuing.
Like some form of circumcision that's happening.
Yeah, and which is also okay. Is that an anachronism? Was there circumcision Maya? And then we'll talk about that. But I'm just saying it's also evidence that the baptism itself was both because they're both mentioned together that this was a
They're kind of linked.
practice. Yeah, that this was a practice being done by either apostates or I mean it was a practice that they were circumcision they were no longer doing at all, right? And so um he has to mention that because there obviously these people were practicing some form of circumcision too, as well as some pagan form of baptism.
Okay.
Here is from the Dresden Codex depicting the baptism. As you can see, they're kind of pouring water. Um, and the Dresden Codex is an almanac, so it kind of is doing date calculations when the ritual should be occurring, dates, that kind of thing. And then they're also here. Um, there's all the hieroglyphs above. It's a practice that was like their gods baptizing other gods or that kind of thing. So it's really it's whatever the practice was by the time of the Maya, they were using it for all kinds of different things, right? Um, and even though it was a practice among the people, they also believed the gods were baptizing each other, that kind of thing. Which I'm not saying it came from Christian concept of Jesus being baptized. Yeah, and I'm saying it actually does more than that, meaning like their gods. It matches. It's not the historic what you would expect from historical Book of Mormon. And then here would be like a translation. So this is not me or anything. This is where even now, people translating these consider it a baptismal theme. These four that are depicted in the Dresden Codex also talk about east, west, north, south. So they're comparing them to the direction. So there's all kinds of like other things built into the kind of their pagan baptism that has to do with their gods or their own belief system. So this is just going through each of the panels that are on the Dresden Codex, right?
Okay.
So you have like the Lord's Son got baptized in the north, and this is associated with the north. This one is the West. And Itzamna, who is the head of the gods, gets baptized, bathes in abundance of has food and drink. Again, that's whole theme that if they're baptized, they can go to heaven and have everything they want to eat and drink. And again, the South. So these are all just the baptism that's shown in the Dresden Codex, the form, which that's what Landa is talking about. Again, I'm talking about I mentioned that the descendants of the people of Ammon might be a good textual match for the audience. Again, Lamanites that may be amenable to be preached to, but are still have pagan practice that, after 300
their own
years.
Tradition, their own religion.
Yeah, right. Lamanite tradition. As we know, everybody kind of came wicked at Mormon's time. So we wouldn't expect the people of Ammon to be righteous necessarily either, but there were some that I would expect because Mormon said they were all wicked, right? But then you have Moroni teaching, Mormon gave a sermon to members of the church and Moronites doing some sort of, outreach missionary work. Well, it's like, okay, it doesn't sound like Nephites are really a good candidate. It seems like there was a group of church members that were Lamanites because Mormon said all the Nephites were wicked. Yeah, and so I get here's kind of where I talk about, they use the word little children, not infant. And the word is also infant is found in Mormon's abridgment in Mosiah. So we know the word existed. He just chose not to use it. It wasn't, he just used little children specifically because that actually was what the Maya practice was. And then as I talked about, he was very strong and forceful, repudiating the practice. It was a gross error, mockery before God, gall of bitterness, bonds of iniquity. This should be cut off, must go down to hell, awful wickedness. I mean, he's like talking about like two members that have some questions about baptism, right? He's talking about a practice that was surrounding that he was very strongly against. I mean, it's a doctrine, right? Some competing doctrine. And then I kind of suppose, well, what was the disputation? Maybe that they didn't feel like they needed to have a baptism because they already had one. That could be a disputation. We don't know. They didn't really say what the
Mm,
disputations were, but you could see there would be conflict between the two practices.
yeah, maybe even people in the church saying, "Hey, they're baptizing their children at a young age. Why don't we could do the same thing,
Yeah.
possibly?"
I mean, I was a missionary in Sicily, right? And I went to a ward, and the lady that gave the opening prayer prayed to Santa Rosalia, who is the saint of the city, right? It's not unknown even now where people still have old practices that they still practice even after they've joined the church.
Right, right.
They carry stuff with them. It's not always just goes automatically away.
Hmm.
So yeah, so you may be right. It may just be a member that were like, hey, I didn't, and they were actually like we had a branch president there who had his kid baptized in the Catholic Church as well, was a baby, and then
Oh,
but it was just to satisfy family, right? Because they were the
right,
other
right.
family. Yeah, so I'm just saying that these competing forms of rituals not unique to Mormons' time.
Okay.
So the conclusion is that baptism of little children is not some discussion by Joseph Smith of a 19th century theological issue. It actually historically existed in the Maya in Mesoamerica, and actually the description of it more closely matches the the Mesoamerican context than anything of Joseph Smith's time. So again, it's not only an anachronism, it's actually evidence of the historicity of the Book of Mormon. When they raise that issue, they're wrong. It's actually evidence of it.
Oh, that's good to address because that's often one of the most clear, obvious 19th century elements people bring up in
Yeah,
the Book of Mormon is infant baptism. And again, I thought it was interesting that you highlighted that it doesn't say infant baptism, but the baptism of little children, and that there is evidence for this, you could say, pagan practice happening among the Mayans, which would make some cultural, contextual sense,
yep.
Mormon writing this. So, yeah, this almost seems to resolve in a way this criticism that this is at least you can't say this is an obvious 19th century element in the text.
Yeah, and I'm saying it actually does more than that, meaning it matches the historic what you would expect from historical Book of Mormon, right? So it's actually evidence of historicity of the Book of Mormon, not an attack.
Very good.
Once you look through the what the practice was, it mirrors. It's consistent with the like ancient Mesoamerican practice.
Very cool.
Okay, now we get to kind of the issue that we may have to discuss in uh, a structured way, so you don't get your video knocked off YouTube. So,
Okay.
so we're going to talk about circumcision in Mesoamerica. There is going to have to be referenced, to genitalia, right? And
Should I give a trigger warning here? This could be graphic.
maybe I'm going to use the term that one of the Spanish guys wrote about it, and he just called it. He didn't use the name of the genitalia. He just called it the virile member. So I'll just refer to VM. Whenever I say VM, you know what I'm talking about.
Okay.
Again, I don't know what they throw off YouTube or not, but I know you have to be careful when you talk about stuff like this. So I'd probably the first podcaster you've ever had banned off YouTube. I don't know that want that to happen.
Yeah, there always has to be a first.
Okay. So again, circumcision is mentioned. Um, we've already talked about the Moroni audience probably being Lamanite, a pagan religion. Um, so we don't have to spend too much time. We already had that discussion. The most specific is to non-members. So again, this is a practice, and like I say, well, circumcision wasn't even around. Wasn't a practice in the church at the time of Mormon because that went away with the law of Moses, right? When Jesus came, he said the law of Moses is done um, away with Christ, right? So but he's having to address it. So it's indicative that there was still circumcision occurring in the pagan population. So you'd have to say, well, where'd that come from? I mean, it could be some independent religious practice, but probably more likely it's some apostate form from apostates that left the church but still practice some of the practices. I mean, that's not atypical when you have a break off from the church. They don't they don't like get rid of every ordinance. They just change it. In fact, Mormon mentions, when the Lamanite, there was a church came that changed the ordinance, maybe had still Christian belief, but changed the ordinances, that kind of thing. I'm not saying that was the one that was practicing circumcision, but that's not atypical that you have a break off that still keeps some residual or some ordinances or some practices, right?
Right.
Like even the Protestants still baptized, when they broke off from the Catholic Church, right? They didn't just abandon everything. Um, um, Again, it's not Nephite. I said that the descendants of people of Ammon probably were a likely, candidate. They actually would have existed up in that area. If you look at the geographic models, the descendants could have been up there in the land northward where they were at the time of the epistle. Let's talk about circumcision in the old world first, because this is actually important as we get into this. Again, this is not only not an anachronism, it's actually probably evidence, a strong evidence of the historicity of the Book of Mormon. So, the practice of circumcision wasn't the same as it is now. Before 140 AD, now they remove all the foreskin. Before it was less severe. The Mesoamerican practice did not involve full foreskin removal. It was like cutting it and using it to form a certain look, or actually consistent with what their religious practice was. And they would actually use it as bloodletting. So they would penetrate this with, stingray spines or things and bleed onto like paper and then burn it. So it was part of their religious practice that they would do bloodletting from the VM, if you want to call it.
Ouch.
Right. Yeah. So the origin of circumcision is not known with certainty, but you have evidence of it in Egypt way back. Also, the biblical scholarship indicates that the standardized practice of the eighth day after birth, that was added to the Bible text. That's not when it was done anciently. The older and more independent sources imply the rite was performed at a later age and was an early association with the secular rite of marriage. Essentially, a rite of passage. You had to be circumcised to be married.
So do you know when they believe the 8 days was added in, like centuries later?
Yeah, they think it was kind of maybe during the exile or something, but they don't know exactly. But it seems like probably pre-exile, it was a different practice, and that's important.
Oh.
So it was after the Lehi would have left that this was changed to 8 days after birth, right? It was a different, and that's why you see in the Old Testament, right? They circumcise adults and that kind of thing.
Mhm.
And here's the biblical references: Exodus 4, Genesis, where you can kind of see that it's a marriage-related rite, a secular rite for marriage, not at 8 days.
Okay.
And the Maya practice that we're going to talk about of baptism is a rite of passage to marriage, as well, as we mentioned, and seems to have been also the circumcision they did was also a rite of passage to puberty or marriage. So it's actually matching the old world pre-exile practice. This is the Egyptian depiction of it. They're holding the one guy's hands. I can see why. So not not a fun procedure, but so it's just showing that it existed in the old world and it wasn't unique to the Hebrews, and they were doing it at an older age, right? Now, circumcision in Mesoamerica, at the time of the conquest, the land had noted that the practice of this overall bloodletting, they called it circumcision. They actually they said this is a form of circumcision. And they did it at their sons of a tender age, which I don't know exactly what that means, but it's probably pre-puberty, right? This temple depiction actually shows kind of the scarring, and then that the ritual had been performed, at least on, was this depiction of an individual or whatever shows it. So there are depictions that show the circumcision, practice of circumcision that Delanda talked about, and actually others talked about it as well. Um, this is kind of a anthropologist that was kind of reflecting what they did. Um, they would scarify, and then they would um, change the form at the end of the VM to virile member. Here's where he calls it a virile member, maybe leaving it to look like ears on each side. And again, it was because they could, then it was easier for them to use a spine and poke through it and then bleed as a bloodletting. And kind of the first depiction we had here, this is actually not the circumcision, but this is a female. They did bloodletting too, but they would poke it through their tongues.
Oh,
And yeah, so they said it was mostly male, but there were also females that engaged in it. And they would just use on the glands, they would use obsidian blades, stingray spines, bone shards, or needles. Um, and then they would actually put the blades in a particular place in a cave, returning them as gifts, along with the blood that was on them back to the earth. So it was actually part of a religious practice, right? Here's where it's documented that this ceremony, bloodletting, occurred as a rite of passage at the time of puberty. So it's actually matching the biblical practice in that sense, right? Because the biblical pre-exile was probably known as prior to marriage, right? Time of puberty. And it was not limited to the priestly class, the depictions. It was actually practiced among most social classes in Mesoamerica. Um, so then that kind of the question is, well, where did this practice come from? We mentioned apostate, but it's also possible that it could have come from Laman and Lemuel when they broke off, the practice. Because again, it wasn't that Laman and Lemuel didn't have a religious belief. They did. They just believed their father was incorrect. They were probably Deuteronomists, that kind of thing. I probably not, don't have that discussion here, but so it's not unreasonable to think that they would have still maintained some practice of the law of Moses as they were wanting to practice it.
mm.
Their main issue is they just didn't like Nephi in charge. That's why they wanted to kill him. So it wasn't necessarily, because he was practicing this different religion.
Okay.
So the conclusion is this discussion of circumcision is not some discussion by Joseph Smith of a 19th century theological issue. That it actually is known in Mesoamerican culture and was probably an issue at the time, again, because you had an apostate practice of it. The fact that it matches the pre-exile practice in Israel is, again, this is not an anachronism proving the Book of Mormon. It's actually showing that it's historical, right? So it's one of these issues people raise. It is fact, it's proving the opposite of what they're asserting. Anyway, so that's kind of the end of this discussion of anachronism.
Okay.
I don't particularly have these in my books, but I do have free books available at this website that other scientific research. I mean, I'll probably put this in the form of a book at some point, a book on the anachronisms. Because again, you see, it's kind of new stuff that you haven't seen before. So that's why
I think a book where you compiled almost like half of a book on like some of the best either connection or evidence, particularly in Mesoamerica for the Book of Mormon, and then one half dealing with a lot of the anachronisms would be really cool. Well, that was part one. Maybe you could say to our listeners, because obviously there's way more anachronisms that we've not covered yet. We're hoping to do 2 more episodes. In the next part, what are we hoping to cover with anachronisms?
Yeah. So the next one, I think, again, there's kind of these miscellaneous ones, and as you've seen, baptism, I've thrown in here, but I am going to try to address the next one more fully. The Nephite animals, even though we talked about swine, I mostly talked about that because it was listed in the Jaredite.
Mm-hmm.
So dealing with the Nephite animals and plants, and then also having some other miscellaneous ones that don't really, kind of I threw compass in here and some of these other ones. So, and then the third one will be dealing with metals primarily, or metallurgical issues. And then again, trying to get all the rest of these other miscellaneous ones, like Greek names or something. There's kind of these
Right.
miscellaneous
Yeah,
that
that'll be good. Like the mention of like churches or Christ's name or things like that.
synagogue. Yeah.
Yeah.
One thing I'm not going to really deal with at all because there's so much on it, and that is like Deutero Isaiah. That I mean, you've had
Right.
multiple. It's like that's a long discussion of which I think you've had people. That's more not really scientific or so much linguistic as much as translation or preference to translation, right? So it's not. I
Maybe in the
mostly
last episode you give maybe your 5 minute take or your view on it. But yeah, you don't need to spend much time on that one.
Yeah, and I mean, again, I'm not really researched that. Meaning, my research is mostly scientific and potentially linguistic. So it's not really a topic I've engaged with that much. Mostly because there's other people that have done way more research on it that are biblical. Looking at biblical scholarship. And I mean, I'm familiar with it. Don't get me wrong,
Hmm.
but I try to, like, if you've seen here, I try to give presentations that are new stuff, right? That are new insights. I don't know that I have any really great new insights on that. I may have a point of view, but I don't necessarily have any.
Yeah, and you're focusing more in your areas of expertise as well, where you've done the most research as well.
Yeah, and like I said, I'm not really an apologist. I just research whatever I want. So I'm not like you ask on anachronisms. I thought, well, I don't know that I've investigated all the anachronisms because I've not really cared too much, but I do have some insights on some of them just because of okay, I'm looking at the Jaredite journey. I did like a book on swords of Shul, so okay, the question kind of came up, and so after the fact, I did a little more research on it, which you've seen here. The results of the elephants actually could be transported. There's no reason they couldn't. They're no bigger than an ox, which nobody questions whether they could take an ox on a boat. But somehow the elephants, they freak out. I'm like, well, it's just because of your mind. It's just because you're imagining these wild elephants running around on the boat. But if they took them as juveniles and they're domestic, that's when they domesticate them anyway.
And then you said that we're probably likely going to do a third part very much devoted to metals and metallurgy anachronism because it's considered quite a big one as
Yeah,
well.
and part of that is, that one is really like location specific too, right? Because the question is, well, they may not have been utilizing metals during all the period because they may have been in an area where there wasn't that much metals, or something. So it's a lot more information you have to, and there's more references to it, right? It's not ether. Okay, you have one mention of animals that's have to deal with.
But so far, I think the ones in this episode, you provide some very plausible explanations for most, if not all, of the anachronisms we looked at, and especially the infant baptism or baptism of children, circumcision, does not really seem anachronistic at all.
Yeah. And in fact, like I say, a lot of times I look into these and I'm like, that's not I wouldn't even use that as an attack if I was trying to prove it's ahistorical, because actually, if you look into it, that's actually supportive of a
Hmm.
historical Book of Mormon. You know?
Well, thanks for coming on and for the time and the research you put in compiling this presentation. I would encourage listeners. We're going to tackle more of the anachronisms, so this is just part one. But if there are specific questions or anachronisms that you want us to cover, I can send them to Jerry as well. Just see if he's got them in his presentation, and we can address some of them. But I think this has been a good start into exploring Book of Mormon anachronisms.
Yeah. And hopefully, it's entertaining and new information. So there'd be some reason to tune in next time,
Yeah,
So
hopefully. So yeah, thanks so much for watching, listeners. If you enjoyed it, give it a like, comment, and subscribe as well. Feel free to donate if you would like to as well, PayPal or Patreon to keep the work going. And go check out Jerry's books as well. Can people support you in any way, Jerry?
Well, my books are all free. I don't really have any hard copies to sell. So it's not like I don't do this for money. So probably the only support is just like forward the podcast that or they find interesting to other people. Right.
Oh,
So
yeah,
they could
yeah.
tune in.
That'll be great as well, just to spread the word, get more people aware. So share this video as well. And we'll see you next time for part 2 on Mormonism with the Murph. Take care. Bye-bye. Thanks everyone for watching this episode. If you've enjoyed it, please give it a like, share it with others who might benefit, and don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss any future content. You can also listen to these episodes on podcast form on Anchor or Spotify, and you can follow me on Facebook, Instagram, and TikTok. Check out my website for more content, personal blog, and more. And if you care to donate to support me, you can via my PayPal or Patreon, or through the website. And you can also give donations via YouTube through Super Chats. Thanks for watching Mormonism with the Murph. Take care. Bye-bye.